Welcome everybody to our policy check-in at the Fiercely Forward Stakeholders Summit. Thank you so much for your participation today and this week. We hope that you've already started engaging in amazing sessions, and we're so excited to be presenting and really conversing collectively today. Thanks again also to our sponsor, Equitas Health. We are so grateful for your support in this work, both on the ground in partnership with us, but also as a financial supporter of this conference. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful that we have actually a representative from Equitas as part of this panel today. So let's get started. I wanted to just set the framework for our panel discussion today. As many of us likely know on this call, Ohio is really considered a low legal equality state. We have not great scores on several metrics, and I'm just going to share in the chat here, the Movement Advancement Project, they have a tracking system across the nation for levels of equality for LGBTQ folks in various states. And you can see that Ohio has a low ranking within this, largely due to some of the policy issues that we're going to discuss collectively today. Some examples: Ohio has laws in place that criminalize people living with HIV and AIDS. We are a state that has 33 localities with non-discrimination protections, but no state or federal law establishing those protections. Until this year, our state was one of two that did not allow for transgender individuals to change the gender marker on their birth certificate. We'll give an update about that today. And we are experiencing threats at a rapid rate. These threats disproportionately impact LGBTQ folks and folks of color, including attempting to ban transgender athletes from competing on teams based on their gender identity or expression, threatening the accurate teaching about race and our history of racism and gender, inhibiting access to voting, and over-criminalization of individuals in Ohio. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that's what today's session is about. And with that, I'm going to just, I guess I'll briefly introduce myself and then kick it to our panelists to introduce themselves. My name is Alana Jochum. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Executive Director of Equality Ohio, and so grateful to be here. I'm going to kick it to the person next to me, and that is Shawn Copeland. Shawn?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shawn Copeland. I'm the State Director for the Human Rights Campaign in Ohio, and I use they, them pronouns, or he, him. We'll just kick it to James.
Hey, my name is James Knapp. I am Chair of Trans Ohio, and you use he, him pronouns when you speak about me. Next up is, I guess, Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. Sabrina Harris, she, her pronouns. I'm Policy Strategist with the ACLU of Ohio, and I will kick it over to Zach.
Hi, thank you. Zach McCune, Public Policy and Civic Engagement Manager for Equitas Health. And my pronouns are he and him.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. And so now we're going to have sort of an interactive panel.
Round this out.
Here we go. I see that we're changing our configuration. Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Dominic. Excellent. So I really want this to be a discussion. All of our folks here and their organizations have sort of an area of core expertise, but frankly, we all work collectively on so many different pieces of this work. I really invite us to share, and if folks could have pop your questions into the chat, and to the degree we can address them in real time, we will go ahead and do that. So we are talking about laws at various levels: the federal, the state, and the local, mostly focusing on the state of Ohio, but really, frankly, national laws catch Ohio as well. So in that vein, starting with the federal, I want to kick this to Shawn. Shawn, you work with the Human Rights Campaign, which has advocated for years for basic non-discrimination protections at the federal level. Can you tell us a little bit about the Equality Act and really give us the basics? Why is this moment particularly urgent with the Equality Act?
Yeah, so I think it's first, when we talk about non-discrimination protections, either at the state or the federal level, is to talk kind of about the universe that we find ourselves in, which is that when most people don't even realize that non-discrimination protections don't exist for LGBTQ people at the federal level, nor do they, in the case of Ohio, do we have a state law. There are some states that do have statewide protections, but Ohio isn't one of them. And so folks are generally familiar with non-discrimination protections when it comes to issues of race, ability disability status, veteran status, but that doesn't exist currently for LGBTQ folks. And the Equality Act is a piece of federal legislation that would essentially provide those protections by inserting sexual orientation and gender identity into all of the laws that we currently have at the federal level that provide non-discrimination protections on those other protected classes. And so what this bill ultimately would do would provide protections at the federal level for employment, housing, credit, jury service, and then any other kind of federal funding programs. It would provide those protections for LGBTQ folks so that they wouldn't be discriminated against in employment, or they wouldn't be be denied housing at the federal level from a landlord or a housing company. So those protections are what the Equality Act would do, and it would do this across the entire country and all states. And so it's incredibly important for LGBTQ folks in states that are unlikely to ever pass non-discrimination protections, so that there is a federal backstop, that there is some form of protections for all LGBTQ Americans. And then it's also important because it provides kind of an even playing field in organizations that are trying to understand what are the non-discrimination laws for their employees, for their customers, for the constituents that they serve. Right now, we kind of live in this absurd scenario where you can drive from New York to California and gain and lose rights depending on what state you're in and what municipality you're in. And so the Equality Act as a piece of federal legislation would kind of make a base case for all levels of non-discrimination protection for LGBTQ citizens. Why it's so important and why it's such a big issue right now is you may recall that the Equality Act was one of the Biden administration's #1 priorities, had a set a goal of signing this as a bill within the first 100 days of his office. While Congress has not met that mark to allow him to sign that yet, but this bill is currently being debated urgently in the Senate. Senate Leader Schumer has made this a priority and has said that he wants to bring a vote on this soon. And so right now, in this moment, there are bipartisan coalitions of legislators, particularly in the Senate, that are talking about this bill and that this bill could have a vote as soon as July.
That's super helpful as an overview. And Shawn, give us just a little bit of background. This is up for we are hearing this is going to be up for a vote. How rare is that? Honestly, I can't remember that being up for a vote in the Senate and the House in the same year, or the same General Assembly, or the same congressional cycle in a really long time.
Yeah, this would be incredibly rare. It would be historic if we have a vote in both the House and the Senate. I think we've, in either this bill or in various forms, other versions of federal non-discrimination protection have had a vote in one or other of the chambers, but not both. And when we really think about this bill, and this is historic, record-setting civil non-discrimination legislation that would provide a drastic change of quality of life for LGBTQ citizens across the country. And so, this is the moment. This is the moment for folks who may have been sitting on the sidelines or not been thinking about what they can do for the movement. Like this is the moment to take action and really push forward, because the one thing that we know that those who are in opposition to the Equality Act, they're doing the same. They are being very active in voicing their opposition to this bill. And so the folks in the LGBTQ movement really need to be engaging now around this bill.
So we know we're in Ohio, and this session is really focused on actions and policy related to Ohio. What is Senator Portman's role, and can you talk a little bit more about the urgency around Senator Portman here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I alluded to just a bit ago that that there's a coalition of bipartisan senators that are talking about the Equality Act, and Senator Portman is one of those senators. He is working to, hopefully, we think, to help build or find a possibility for consensus in the Senate to pass the Equality Act. And so for Ohioans, he has stated publicly that he opposes discrimination, doesn't think discrimination should happen, but he also has concerns around, as he stated, around religious liberty concerns. But what he really needs to hear and what's really important is that he hears from constituents about their support for the Equality Act. This bill provides the protections for LGBTQ Ohioans and LGBTQ citizens nationally. And he really just needs to hear from everyday folks about how this bill could help their life. If you've experienced discrimination before, letting him know what that discrimination was and how it impacted you. If you know someone, if you have someone in your family who is LGBTQ and that this concerns you, Senator Portman needs to hear from you, because these messages, these voices go into the kind of the conversations that he is having to hopefully get him to a enthusiastic yes for the Equality Act. And I see here that Dominic has shared this action image. If you call that number, 888-439-0303, that will patch you into a kind of voicemail service that helps you call Senator Portman. You just put in your zip code and it'll let you go through and call both of your senators here. Portman being the undecided vote and thought leader in getting this bill passed.
Super helpful, Shawn, and thank you for the update there. It's really exciting to see actual urgency around this bill, in that we know it's going to be scheduled for a vote soon. So really these calls matter. I know that sometimes folks pick up the phone and say, well, why does my single call matter? Can you give your perspective on that, Shawn? What is the power of one phone call?
The power of one phone call could be the story or decision that changes a lawmaker's thought on this. Collectively, the way that legislators and senators think about contacts from constituents is they broadly think of this as a tally, and so they're counting the pros and con calls that are coming into their office on a daily basis, and they're making an assessment of how important this issue is with their constituents, right? Like all legislators, their number one goal usually is to get reelected. With Senator Portman in this case, he is not running for reelection, and so maybe that there's some hopeful opportunity here that we can just make the case. We all know in the LGBTQ movement that there are stories that show the need for non-discrimination protection. People losing housing at the last minute, the moment that they mentioned that they had a same-sex partner, to trans folks who can't get reliable and competent medical service because their trans identity somehow supersedes a broken arm. And so hearing from folks who have experienced that kind of discrimination, or folks who are worried about that type of discrimination in their family and what that means for them as Ohioans, could be incredibly impactful to Senator Portman, and incredibly impactful to legislators of all types when they confront what it actually means to not have these protections on our law books.
Thanks so much, Shawn. And I'm seeing lots of people coming and going throughout the session. This is really great. Just a reminder to ground us, this is a policy discussion about issues impacting LGBTQ folks for Ohio. We've got guests from the ACLU, Trans Ohio, HRC, and Equitas Health here today talking about this. I'm going to bring that conversation that you just talked about for the Equality Act, Shawn, to the state level. We know that these laws exist at the federal level, and we're trying to become part of those laws. We're trying to expressly protect sexual orientation and gender identity at the federal level. We're also trying to do the same thing at the state level. And in fact, we have a broad sweeping coalition of partners working to advance the Ohio Fairness Act. What are some of the differences between the Ohio Fairness Act and the Equality Act? And why do we need both of these pieces of legislation? Why is one just not good enough? And I guess I'll give that to you, Shawn, to set the framing, but really inviting anybody to discuss this piece.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There are differences between the two bills, between a federal bill, which protects every American citizen, and a state bill that applies to Ohio citizens only. And in both of those cases, there are some additional differences. So one example of a difference between the federal bill is kind of under federal non-discrimination legislation or legal precedents. The size of the business, for example, really matters. It really applies for your really large employers. And so there are many cases, and by our account, depending on how you count it and slice it, up to 50% of employers in the United States don't meet the legal threshold for federal non-discrimination protections because they don't hire enough employees. So we often find that like state laws, including the Ohio Fairness Act, are far more precise and far more rigorous in their defense of non-discrimination protections because of some of those peculiarities in federal non-discrim law. Another example of the difference, the Equality Act is actually far more exhaustive than a lot of state laws. So while like the Ohio Fairness Act would apply protections for housing, employment, and public accommodations, they may not always, in certain cases, have some of kind of the far-reaching applications in things like jury service and credit. And so we need a bit of both. We need these federal protections, and we also need these state protections that are really more exhaustive at the state level and making sure that all LGBTQ Ohioans are protected.
Super helpful, Shawn. So the Ohio Fairness Act has been introduced for over a decade at this point, actually by Senator Antonio, who was part of our legislative video at the top of this presentation. It has gained significant momentum over the last several General Assemblies, and including in this General Assembly, it was introduced with bipartisan support, the same bill in both the House and the Senate side. It has numerous co-sponsors, both from the Democratic side and the Republican side. We're really encouraged at the bipartisan reach of this bill this session. And so we are hopeful that hearings might start as soon as this fall on this bill. But real talk, we've also had some threats. And that is saying it mildly. Ohio has often been on offense in this work, working to pass the Ohio Fairness Act at the state level. But this year we have seen a shift in tone and tenor of our legislators, and we have seen a stronger push for legislation that threatens the LGBTQ community and would set us backwards. James, I just want to turn to you to talk about some of these threats that we are experiencing right now at the state level in our collective work together. What are we seeing?
Thanks, Elena. I am here for the real talk. I'm here to talk today about the Save Women's Sports Act, which I've been calling the No Trans Girls Allowed Act, because that's really what it is. It doesn't protect women and it doesn't save women's sports. The intent of both of these bills, House Bill 61 and Senate Bill 132, is to exclude transgender student athletes from participating in school sports. I'm going to talk about these two bills as if they're the same, even though I want everyone to be aware that there are two bills moving right now. One is in the House, and there's actually a hearing on this Thursday, and the other is in the Senate, which I think is still sitting for the time being. And I don't foresee movement until later on in this year, if not next year in the fall. But what's so dangerous about this bill is it literally prevents all Ohio schools, including private schools, from allowing transgender student athletes to participate in school sports. So what I mean by participation is they can't compete, they can't sit on the bench, they can't ride the team bus, they can't be the team mascot, they can't participate in schools at all. And the way this bill is so broadly written, it doesn't just hurt trans female students, it also hurts trans masculine students and also cis women and cis girls. It creates a cause of action for any participant that's deprived of athletic opportunity, which under this bill basically just means playing on the same team as a student athlete who you find out is transgender, or participating against someone who you find out is transgender. So really what this is doing is it's creating kind of gender policing within school teams and within schools where that wasn't happening before. And for you to really understand the harm of this, the Ohio High School Athletic Association and the National Collegiate Athletic Association already have policies that allow transgender students to play, and they have had zero issues. There have been zero documented problems. This whole thing was kicked off by a lawsuit in Connecticut that now has been dropped. So the fact that Ohio is moving forward with this kind of boggles the mind because it violates federal law, it violates our own Ohio policies, and it doesn't just harm transgender students, it also harms cis students, because it starts with the presumption that anyone who's assigned male at birth is inherently better at sports than anyone who is assigned female at birth. And that is just categorically false. That should offend everyone, whether you are trans or not, whether you're a cis woman or not. But really anyone who is accused of being trans, so anyone who is perhaps too tall, perhaps too fast, perhaps too manly or too butch, and perhaps, someone may just not like this girl and they accuse her of being transgender. She then bears the responsibility of proving that she is not transgender by having a signed doctor letter that states that her internal and external genitalia conforms with female genitalia. You should not need a pap smear to run cross country, ever. Also, a test that says that she has normally produced testosterone within the normal level. Females who have PCOS don't have normal testosterone levels. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to play volleyball. Also, there's nothing in the bill that actually says what normal testosterone levels is. And I'll say as someone who takes testosterone supplements, it varies wildly. So for females, it's anywhere from 0 to like 20. It's like 200 to 125. 1,200. It's very wide, and having abnormal testosterone doesn't necessarily give you an advantage at all. But also the other test is analysis of genetic makeup. So that would be karyotyping. So that's imaging of your individual genes, usually to determine abnormality, but in here to determine your chromosomal sex. The problem with that is it's a very expensive procedure, and who pays for it? The school doesn't pay for it. It's the students' parents who pay for it. So the real harm in this bill is we have active trans students right now playing sports who are now scared to participate, who now don't want to participate in their own sports, coming out of a pandemic where they haven't been able to see their friends. Now they're told they can't participate with their friends and peers because they're transgender. And this bill does address both trans men and trans women, but I do want to point out that it's explicitly the point of this bill to exclude trans girls and trans women. And it doesn't really mention trans men, besides the fact that in the beginning of the bill, it says that there will be 2 different teams, one for males and one for females. And this bill just continues to call trans girls individuals of the male sex and includes them in, lumping them in with cis boys, which is just, it's false. So we do need folks to call Chair Manning and the rest of the committee members to let her know that this bill isn't necessary, it's discriminatory, and it's harmful. It harms both trans females as well as, yes, we have some numbers up here to call, as well as cisgender girls who will be basically targeted for being too good at sports. There's also a racial component, and it kind of annoys me that people aren't speaking about this as much. But historically, Black athletes have been accused of using testosterone or being secretly men or, being transgender just because they happen to be Black and good at sports. And we've seen this with Castor, who is intersex but is not transgender. She has normal testosterone in her body. And I don't think that would happen if she were, a white athlete. And this is the same that we're seeing across the nation here. There have been 33 states to push these same kind of bills, and 100 different bills have moved forward. And when you look at the trans girls that they're pointing to, saying that this is the fear, it's Black trans athletes. It's Black trans female athletes. And that's just, I'm losing my words, I'm upset about it, but there's definitely a lot of harm to these bills, and we need to stop them before they become law. Because like I said, we're going to lose money on this because, Ohio's in the NCAA, Ohio High School Athletic Association, and even the CYO, the Christian Youth Organization, doesn't have policies like this. So people who will come out and say that there's a religious exemption to this and there's a religious portion of this bill, there really isn't. And they're just hiding behind that to kind of push forward discrimination, because that's really all this bill does, is it discriminates against trans girls specifically.
And thank you so much for that overview, as disheartening as it is to see a bill like this actively moving in the Ohio legislature. For those who have been joining in the interim, this is a bill that would prohibit transgender young people and all sports folks from playing this on the team based on their gender identity or expression, when right now the Ohio High School Athletic Association already regulates this without issue, and that this is not an issue here in Ohio.
And has for a decade at this point.
That's right. That's right. It's been for a long time. And in fact, am I right that the Olympics have had a policy in place for more than a decade?
Right. And no Olympian, no transgender Olympian has won gold, has won silver, has won bronze. So this fallacy that, you know, transgender women who are just inherently better at sports are dominating across the field and stealing scholarship opportunities, stealing gold medals, that's just not happening anywhere.
That's right. And I want to just see if ACLU and HRC might chime in about this from a national perspective, because you do have national views on this across the country. We've seen these bills pass more frequently across the country than ever before. What are your thoughts on that? Is this part of a playbook that we're seeing?
Yeah, take a little. So as mentioned, you know, we've seen these types of bills in multiple states. I think 33 in total. And as you mentioned, Alana, some of them have passed. And I want to remind folks that you know, politics in the United States kind of works in this way, in which a major victory or a major step forward in one arena, in that case for us, the federal arena under the Biden administration, and kind of the interpretation of Bostock and how that is now impacting lots of, as we're seeing lots of rulings coming out from the federal administration on the protections that exist for LGBTQ Americans. We're seeing our opposition trying to roll back and stop protections at the state level. And so we see this very much as a kind of a backlash to grounds that we're winning in other arenas. And so this bill, in every state that it's been introduced, is fundamentally a solution in search of a problem. It doesn't provide any actual, there's no actual issue that they're trying to address. It's a conservative wedge issue that really just uses trans people as kind of a political football. It's a really, kind of nuanced conversation. It's unless you really are in the in-depth weeds of trans athletics and things, that it's really difficult for the average person who's may never met a trans person to really get their head around what this bill actually does. And the way that the opposition presents this in all of these states is much to the way that James presented this, as a kind of a racist and transphobic cartoon of what it actually means. And I think about it this way: at the end of the day, like, we're talking about children, we're talking about athletics. Most people that play athletics at the high school level or even at the elementary level, they're not professional athletes. They're not going to be professional athletes. And finally, just going to put the thing that really sets us apart for me is, as James mentioned, this kind of the impetus for this came from a case that was ultimately dismissed and dropped in Connecticut, in which two cis female athletes sued two trans athletes that had beaten them in some competitions. Later within that year, those same cis athletes beat those trans athletes, proving that the competition was fair. Right? This really is a non-issue, and I think the kind of fundamental value that we should be thinking about in all of these states is that athletics, particularly at the high school level and collegiate level, are all about inclusion and making sure that everyone has a safe place to play.
Shawn, since we're talking about the lawsuit, those two cis girls who sued under the idea that they were going to lose out on athletic scholarships because they lost that one race. Both of those girls got scholarships to college. The two trans girls did not.
That's a really striking point to illustrate here, James. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I did want to point out that there are 4 states now that have anti-trans sports bills. The first is Idaho. That was the first to pass a bill. That's still under court injunction. So that bill, that law hasn't gone into effect. There's Florida and there's Tennessee, which is the only state now in the nation that you can't change your birth certificate if you're trans or non-binary, which I think is telling because part of their bill mentions what's on your original birth certificate. So how cruel is that to legislate trans folks unable to change their documentation and then write into the bill, you know, if they had proper documentation, they could play. What the other is Arkansas, which in addition to the anti-trans sports bill also passed an anti-trans medical bill. Now, Ohio doesn't have that, thank goodness, but we have snuck in some pretty bad language in the Ohio state budget. And the whole budget is full of stuff that, as an advocate, I'm going to tell you to please call on. But for this purpose, Section 3909, it gives anyone working in the medical field, so employees and contractors, doctors, all the way down to janitors, the liberty to exclude you from services or for paying from services. So that means your insurance company, based on their own assumptions of your gender identity or sexual orientation and how they can relate that to their own personal beliefs. So I can't think of a more open-ended license to discriminate than that portion of the bill. And I know we're not talking about that right now, but it's an action item. Please call the committee members that decide Ohio's budget bill.
Thank you, James. I know we're going to turn to the budget in just a few minutes because there really were some horrible things that were put in last minute to that. Sabrina, from ACLU, just want to invite you into the conversation, especially from a national perspective. These anti-trans sports bills, what's your take on them?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. I think, Shawn and James really summarized it really well. I think that Shawn's description in terms of, coming up with a solution to a problem that doesn't exist is hitting the nail on the head. We have seen it's a coordinated attack nationwide. You just heard the states that are, putting forth this legislation. And I think, as we all know, trans women are women, trans girls are girls, period. There's so many benefits to having inclusiveness when it comes to sports for youth. I mean, you can go on and on around, the facts that, are for, having that equal participation.
Thanks, Sabrina. And to just ground us as we close out this portion of our conversation, again, this bill has been introduced at the Ohio House side and the Ohio Senate, where we are seeing, and that it will eventually have to work through both processes and pass through both chambers of the House and be signed by the governor before it were to become law. So it has not become law, but it's obviously a threat and moving its way through the system. And what we're nervous about as advocates who work day in and day out at the Statehouse is that this is moving faster and getting more attention in hearings than we've ever seen before. Specifically this Thursday, we know that there is a hearing for those who are in favor of this bill, proponent testimony that will be happening. So we will hear those arguments. And then if the process continues, frankly, we hope the process doesn't continue at all, but if it does continue, we will have a chance to oppose those arguments with advocate testimony as well. Dominic has just put in the chat a link to submit testimony in opposition to HB 61, which is this anti-trans youth sports bill. It's a simple form. All of this matters. Your voice matters to the overall collective voice against this in Ohio, and specifically to your story. What is the reason that this hurts you, or you are fearful that this harms your family? Please make those phone calls and submit this testimony in opposition to this bill, and then continue to look for action alerts from Equality Ohio, Trans Ohio, and the other organizations here as we move through this process. We will be watching it very, very carefully.
Right. Even if you're not trans or don't know someone who is trans, please call. Because this affects every single person, and listen to the way the proponents, or sort of people who are in favor of this bill, listen to the way they talk about this bill. It's always, there are grown men playing against our little girls. And that's not what's happening. That's a gross mixed characterization. These are students, student athletes at the same level playing against each other. So there is no grown man coming in pretending to be a transgender to participate against little girls so that he can win because he couldn't participate on his own. That is a theory that was floating out there in the first hearing, and it's so absurd. I want you to hear for it again. Let's listen for grown men playing against our little girls.
Thank you for sharing that awful opposition messaging, James, so that we can be familiar with it. So we know that there are there are a plethora of issues that impact LGBTQ folks, and specifically LGBTQ folks of color at the Statehouse, that we need to advance, that we need to fight against. If you're just joining, that's what this conversation is about here today, and how our various organizations here you see on the screen are advancing that work or defending against that work at the Statehouse. I'd like now to turn to Zach McCune from Equitas Health. It may not be known widely that in Ohio, it is actually criminalized in certain ways for a person to simply be living as who they are if they are living with HIV and AIDS. Let me say that again. A person's status is criminalized by certain laws here in Ohio. And we have been working to undo those laws, to modernize those laws, to actually match science. I'm guessing many of us grew up hearing in health class about the transmission of HIV and AIDS. Most of what we learned is no longer true. Most of what we have learned is outdated. And yet we still have policies that are based on outdated scientific principles and folks who are legislating in this area that do not know the real science. So Zach, can you talk a little bit more about this and the efforts to modernize Ohio's laws?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for teeing that up, Alana. You know, it's incredibly important that we not only take this time to acknowledge and to empower ourselves to take action on behalf of those living with HIV, but also to understand and acknowledge that we're now into the HIV epidemic, and we still have statutes on the books here in Ohio and across the nation that, like Alana said, criminalize someone just for their status alone. And we'll get into those a little bit more as well, but I want to talk about that group that Alana was mentioning that is working right now as a consortium to help push this policy change here in the state of Ohio, in partnership also with some national folks as well, because there is momentum across the country to modernize or even to repeal in some states these HIV statutes that are on the books. Shawn did a great job earlier talking about the patchwork of protections that exist for LGBTQ plus folks. If you're driving across state lines, the same may be true for you with your HIV status. So there are currently 31 states, now 31, because the state of Illinois actually just recently repealed their criminalization laws as related to HIV. But there are 31 states, including Ohio, that have HIV-specific laws that impose criminal penalties, such as misdemeanors or felony punishments, for behaviors that otherwise would not have been criminalized had they not been a person living with HIV. And so there are 6 statutes currently on the books here in Ohio: selling or donating blood, harassment with a bodily substance, loitering to engage in solicitation, prostitution. Those are enhancement penalties often associated with an action or a behavior that may already be criminalized. But then there's also the felonious assault statute, which is the one where we most specifically target our advocacy with particularly folks who are living with HIV, and then also those who may be enforcing these laws. And it's why it's so incumbent for us to change them. As a person living with HIV, if you do not disclose your status, you may be charged under the felonious assault statute. That does not even require actual transmission. That doesn't take into consideration your intent or your state of mind, meaning if you are engaging in sexual intercourse with a partner and you are taking prophylactic measures, barrier protections, condom use, you have a partner who is adherent to PrEP, maybe you were virally suppressed. We're going to talk about some of those other items here in a moment, and you do not transmit HIV and you do not intend to transmit HIV, you can still be prosecuted under the statute. That is unfair, it is unjust, unscientific, and it's time for these laws to be modernized. It's important for us, like I said, when we're talking about this felonious assault statute as well, to talk about all of the advancements in care, treatment, and prevention that we have at our disposal now. When these laws were passed, they were really, here in Ohio specifically, the laws were passed in the late 1990s, I believe it was 1999. And we had been as a community experiencing significant loss, but also at this point in time, really emerging with some advancements in science as well. So treatment for HIV is getting better. We had HIV testing at our disposal. These laws were still being used and passed, frankly, to discriminate against those living with HIV. At the time, you may remember that HIV was specifically linked to gay and bisexual men and was known as a gay disease in the 1980s. And often it continues to be associated with LGBTQ plus people specifically. And that's also something that we need to do some education about, because HIV affects everybody. Everybody could be at risk of transmission if they engage in certain behaviors that fall into a risk-related category. It's incumbent upon us to once again, like I said, reframe this as a public health issue. We should not be adding criminal penalties because of chronic manageable condition. Oftentimes, folks can take one pill a day. And if they adhere to this pill, they could be virally suppressed, meaning their viral load is so low and insignificant that they could not then transmit the virus to a partner through sexual intercourse. So we call that U equals U, meaning undetectable is untransmissible equals untransmissible. And it's a huge mechanism for us as advocates, aid service organizations, healthcare providers, advocacy organizations to really lead and drive this message forward. U equals U is a great tool that's at our disposal as well. But in concert with Equality Ohio, Equitas Health, the Center for HIV Law and Policy, CareCole, and many advocates living with HIV, so long-term thrivers, as many of our champions within the steering committee will say, to really lead the modernization efforts here in Ohio. And we operate under the name of the Ohio Health Modernization Movement. Like I said, we are working to modernize those laws here in Ohio. I see that Don put that in there as well. And we really want to get out the message, and I'll refocus some of steps as well. So I said earlier that Ohio's law is unjust. What do I mean by that? Currently in Ohio, a person living with HIV can go to prison for up to 8 years for not disclosing their status before engaging in sexual contact, even when they did not intend to harm anybody and no harm resulted. And the way that harm is being defined here is the transmission of HIV. So even if they do not transmit, if they disclose or cannot prove that they disclosed, they can be prosecuted under the statute. And keep in mind, that is a more severe punishment than for reckless homicide, sexual battery, or even arson. Ohio's law is also unscientific. So I mentioned 40 years have passed since the start of this epidemic, and over 20 years have passed since this law has been signed here in the state of Ohio, meaning that our laws currently still punish behavior that we now know to pose no risk or negligible risk of HIV transmission. It also incorrectly assumes that HIV is still a death sentence, when in reality, like I said, we know that this is a chronic manageable condition, and many people thrive and continue to live healthy and productive lives with HIV. And it does not count for the current methods that anybody living with HIV could be using to prevent actual transmission. So I mentioned some barrier protections earlier. I mentioned viral suppression and also low risk sexual behaviors, right? So we know that oral sex, use of toys, things like that does not really carry a risk of transmitting the virus. However, the laws that we have here in Ohio still do not take those into consideration. I will also highlight that there is something that a person who is HIV negative can use. It's a once daily pill. It's commonly referred to as PrEP, and the pill associated is either Truvada or Descovy, that HIV negative people can take on a daily basis, and when adhered to regularly, can reduce the risk of transmission by 99%. So it's 99% effective in preventing a person not living with HIV from contracting the virus. And so the current law obviously doesn't take that into consideration as well. And having these laws on the books in general, it's just very unproductive as it relates to public health, because there is no evidence that HIV criminal laws actually promote public health by increasing disclosure, HIV testing, or safer sex practices. In fact, we actually know that they act as a deterrent for people to actually get tested and know their status, because if you do not know your HIV status, you cannot be prosecuted for then failing to disclose that that status. So it acts as a barrier for folks to get tested, and then allows folks to unknowingly potentially spread the virus or infect partners. And by singling out a condition here in Ohio that we know is manageable, the current law stigmatizes people living with HIV and undercuts our response as providers, as advocates to the epidemic. And so it's time for them to go. Not only do we oppose them as direct service providers at Equitas Health and as an advocacy coalition through the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, but they're also not supported by the CDC, by the National Medical Association, the State Medical Association, the ACLU nationally, and HIV modernization was actually a priority under even the former president's ending the HIV epidemic initiative. And so that we know that there should be and can be bipartisan support for movement here in Ohio, particularly modernization. And we are very intentional, knowing the composition of our legislature and what could politically and feasibly be possible, that we have to work to modernize, to make sure that we are removing those penalties that are associated with scientifically inaccurate information, and reducing the criminal penalty and adding elements in there that require state of mind, require actual harm to occur as well. So we are working to right now educate our policymakers on the state of HIV. Like I said, we're 40 years into the HIV epidemic, and that initial onset is all folks know. And that's not saying that's a Republican understanding or a Democratic understanding. We have to do this education with everybody in the General Assembly, with staff, young folks, old folks, to make sure that they know how to further tend to this community, and make sure that they are not using language that stigmatizes somebody who is living with HIV as well.
What a tremendous amount of information you shared. And I know that, we work in this space with this all the time, and I've learned something just here today. Really, so much of what we learned and grew up with about HIV is just outdated now. And these laws are harmful relics of a past time. They were harmful back then, but they're especially harmful now when science is really not accounted for in them at all. In our chat is the Ohio Health Modernization Movement website. And what this is a coalition of organizations that focus on policy, HIV access, HIV advocacy, as well as individuals living with HIV and AIDS. It is a united front with people living with HIV and AIDS always having the ability to override any decision of the organizations as part of the coalition. It's a truly led movement by people living with HIV and AIDS. And we are hopeful that legislation will be introduced this very session to overhaul the laws that you have just talked about, Zach. I know that is a positive development that we're looking for probably late this summer or early this fall. And then you will see some opportunities to advocate in favor of this. It probably is an educational journey for our legislators, but just as you said, so much bipartisan possibility here. This really is something everybody can understand and make our laws align with. Thank you. Just want to remind folks, if you have questions or if you have thoughts about anything that we're talking about today in terms of policy and the focus of this collective efforts to advance legislation or stop it at the Statehouse, the federal level, and even a little bit at the local level, please pop them in the chat and we will get to those towards the end of this session. Now I'd like to turn it to Sabrina. Sabrina from ACLU of Ohio. ACLU is just leading on so many fronts to protect our civil liberties at any given time. So often, I think our work at Equality Ohio is so challenging. And then I think of ACLU when you have so many different policy areas that you need to be expert in and that you are fighting at any given moment. So truly, first off, hats off to you. Thank you for what you are doing. And I also want to give a huge celebration and shout out to the ACLU. As James mentioned, we know that Ohio was one of 2 states that did not allow transgender people to change the gender marker on their birth certificate. One of 2 states, and folks, Mississippi and Alabama were not on that list. It was Ohio and Tennessee. And it was the efforts of 4 very brave plaintiffs and ACLU leading a lawsuit in that charge to find that practice to be unconstitutional. We got a wonderful ruling from that case at the very beginning of this year. And then it has now translated into the Ohio Department of Health declaring that they will accept changes to the birth certificate process for gender markers. So really, Sabrina, just hats off to you. Thank you for you and your colleagues at ACLU doing that work. And a little plug for Equality Ohio's Legal Clinic, Trans Ohio's Equitas, Equality Ohio's Octopuses, and Living with Change's collective legal clinic efforts around these gender marker changes that are now underway in Ohio. June 26 will be the next one. I'll put that data in our chat below. But Sabrina, you have so much that you can share on so many different fronts. Why don't we start with the budget? We started to talk about that a little bit earlier, but please tell us what is happening with the budget process and what are some of these awful things that have been tucked into it?
Thank you so much, Alana, and thank you just for the kudos. Work with fantastic legal minds, and I just have to again, uplift the clinic opportunities. And so many of you on the call, just thank you for the work that you're doing on the ground to make this implementation process as smooth as it can be, knowing that there are going to be some bumps in the road, but we're really excited that we've gotten to this place. To switch gears and talk about something less exciting is definitely the budget. As you heard from James, we have just been seeing some really, really concerning amendments that have gotten slipped in, and that's being generous with the language. So just to kind of back up a little bit, right now, all eyes are on the Statehouse and looking at the budget specifically. So every 2 years, the Ohio legislature passes a budget bill to fund state government. And it's really a time, unfortunately, that they're using as well to include a variety of laws and language into the bill that have nothing to do with the budget. And we saw that this budget year, and unfortunately, it's more extreme. So the Ohio General Assembly in the 11th hour packed Ohio's operating budget with provisions that will hurt Ohioans. Specifically, these provisions threaten the health and safety of LGBTQ Ohioans, people seeking reproductive health care, Ohioans with disabilities, and even making more challenging to exercise your right to vote. First and foremost, the amendment, the language, that really is the most radical, most concerning that James mentioned earlier in the presentation is that the language allows healthcare providers and insurers to discriminate against fellow Ohioans for religious, moral, ethical reasons. And I use the quotes very deliberately there because it's so incredibly broad. And what does that mean? Let alone how are we defining, different groups that are outlined in this measure? The practical implications could include, Catholic hospitals that were refusing to admit LGBTQ Ohioans, health insurance companies refusing to pay for contraception, doctors blocking fertility treatment, and so much more. And that's because the language is so incredibly broad. It's just really, truly a license to discriminate. It could allow every type of healthcare provider and employee of a healthcare provider. So we're, not just nurses and doctors, but receptionists, assistants. It's so far reaching. And it could really be to refuse care based on your beliefs. And again, it's so oversweepingly broad that it's incredibly dangerous. So just in short, the adoption of this language is going to result in less healthcare access across the state when someone doesn't like you or doesn't believe in what you do. And that's just not the Ohio that we want to see, particularly, again, this is put into the budget bill. And I think, we can go over some other provisions and language, but I think another big piece of this is that this language was inserted so late into the process. There are no opportunities for the public to, provide input through testimony. So just to plug, action alerts, particularly, I know dropped in the chat is Equality Ohio's on this particular amendment itself. Please fill this out. You need to have your voice be heard through this process. The way that it's looking and the deadline for the budget is July 1st. So that's why I say, really time is of the essence this week and next. The Statehouse is going to be focused on the budget. They're looking to, kind of figure out and pass this and get this to where it needs to be. So you need to let your voice be heard on these, terrible provisions now. And I can definitely kind of go into more details about those, but I think it's just really important, again, make your voice heard. Everything needs to pass by July 1st. Do want to note that this bill was approved by the Senate on June 9th after previously passing the House. The Senate included a lot of the language that we're talking about that we have a lot of concerns about. So right now where the bill is in the process is representatives from the House and the Senate, referred to as the conference committee. They're kind of coming together to iron out, the different versions. So that's why it's really important that they know that Ohioans are upset with the changes that happened in the Senate. So as they're having those conversations to iron it out, once they determine kind of what the final budget looks like, they will send that to Governor DeWine. And I do want to note that Governor DeWine has line item veto power. So there are other opportunities for advocacy here, but make your voice heard early on and continue to push, because we do not want to see the language as it currently is.
Sabrina, thank you so much. And thank you for being one of the organizations on this team here as a watchdog to the State House. It's these last minute moments that some of these things are snuck into the budget. Frankly, but for the activation of everybody on this call, this may never have even been noticed and would have just gone through without a fight. But truly, we are seeing responses. We are hearing from our legislators say, oh, I didn't know that this piece was in here. I didn't know that this was a part of the conversations. You're right, because it wasn't part of the discussions normally in the budget. It was tucked in at the very last minute. We know that hospitals have been exceedingly angry over this, that health insurance is also upset about it. Actually, it really has triggered a lot of response from various industries, but every single email that you can send through the link that's in the chat collectively adds to that fighting this measure from going forward. Thank you so much. Sabrina, you have so many different areas that you could talk about. Maybe can you turn to some hopeful pieces? We actually have some hopeful pieces of legislation that impact LGBTQ folks across the state disproportionately, that are not specifically focused on LGBTQ alone, but tell us about some good news.
I would love to. You have to take these small wins and we see them as very big wins. Very excited to announce, on the criminal legal system side, we are seeing legislation that's pushing for much needed reform. And that is in two areas. The first is through bail reform. We were extremely thrilled to see in mid-May, there was legislation that was announced to reform Ohio's pretrial system. So that is Senate Bill 182 and House Bill 315. They're proactive, companion, bipartisan bills that are really a long time coming. And both bills are going to eliminate wealth-based detention by reforming our pretrial system. And, we believe in reforming Ohio's bail system so that release decisions are dependent on an individual circumstance and not how much money they have. And that's what this legislation is going to address. And we are just, again, really thrilled. We're also thrilled just by the huge amount of bipartisan support that this has across the legislature. So Senate Bill 182 is being primarily sponsored by Senators McCauley and Senator Steve Huffman with 4 co-sponsors. And then on the House side, we have House Bill 315 is being sponsored by Representative Hillier and Leland and 43 bipartisan co-sponsors. So we were incredibly excited to see this push. And in terms of where these bills are,
before you go to where they are, can you just take one step back? Not everybody on this call, I'm guessing, understands even the basic concept of bail. Can you just give a basic overview of what that is and what this bill then would try to do?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. I'm getting so excited with the legislative side of things. So, as I mentioned, our current system is really based on what you have monetarily in terms of if you are going to be held pretrial. So if we're looking, there's about 12,000 Ohioans each and every day that are being held as innocent. They're innocent. They have not been proven guilty of a crime. They are being held behind bars because they can't afford their freedom. And that's a system that is broken. And so really what this legislation will do is it's going to fix this. So really specifically, it's going to look in terms of making sure within 24 hours, there's an initial release decision. So folks can return to their community when they are legally innocent. So the bill, what that really kind of means is it provides a presumption of release. So it creates a release path. So individuals who pose no threat to any person, they're not a flight risk, they can return to their communities, their homes in 24 hours. And why that's so important is because when folks are being held behind bars while they are innocent because of what they don't have, they are not able to go to their jobs. They may not be able to, for childcare. If you have children, you aren't able to be there for your kiddos. These are real things that are, cause trauma to the individual that's experiencing it and everyone that's in their circle. So it's just so incredibly important, that we kind of change the system. And that's exactly what these bills are looking for. And I think it kind of really cuts at this argument of public safety. We are actually shifting the system. The system right now isn't looking at public safety. It's looking at how much money you have. You can have two people that are accused of, doing the same thing. And if you have the money to, post your bond, you can be out and there you go. If you don't, then you are sitting behind bars until you're able to, have your hearing. And for most folks, that can be just such a challenge. And again, all of the collateral consequences that come from that. So just to kind of take a step back, why this is so important. And we heard a lot of these stories last week on the Senate side. Senate Bill 182 had its second hearing for proponent testimony. And it was such a just momentous and huge moment. We had those folks that were up there, kind of just what I did, but more technically savvy than I am with the policy wonkiness of why bill reform, needs to happen now, and making all the arguments. But I believe there were 46, 47 folks that submitted written testimony and were there to testify. And so they told their stories. So these are folks that have had experience with the system, and they're saying it doesn't work, and here's why. And I think it's just incredibly powerful. We're talking about, reaching out to your legislators so they can know the story. If you're comfortable sharing, the power of that just can't be overstated. It gives, a voice to the issue. Legislators now have a name and a face in a specific instance that they can look to when they're thinking about, okay, should we move this legislation forward? So it's incredibly powerful. We were very excited. We're kind of waiting to see what will come up next on the Senate side. And then for the House side, we are currently waiting for that second hearing. So we're waiting for proponent testimony. So if you are interested, that's an opportunity to raise your voice. You can always testify, action alerts, any type of engagement that you're comfortable with, we definitely encourage. And really, we can move this forward because of voices like yours.
That's such a great reminder, Sabrina, that truly, I think if there's any takeaway from this session, it is that your voice matters, and mobilizing quickly when we get these alerts is imperative, because you will have a legislator at the end of whatever number we asked you to call with a tally pad saying who is for this and who is against this. And we know that our opponents are equally calling in and trying to give that support on the opposite side. So we need to both be calling and really we need to be drowning out those voices with our own calls. Sabrina, give us one more good news. I know that you have been doing so much in a coalition around death penalty reform. Just give us a quick update there, because I think that, so often while we're seeing these horrible pieces of legislation move through, to have in the same conversation the idea that Ohio might also be ending the death penalty sometimes seems a little bit, it seems cognitively dissonant that we would be having those conversations at the same time.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So we are working in coalition as part of a campaign, No Death Penalty Ohio. You can check out nodeathpenaltyohio.com for a list of resources. And really, we're excited because, again, we're seeing bipartisan push legislatively to end the death penalty once and for all in Ohio. There's a lot of momentum at the state level. There's a lot of momentum nationally. There are 23 states plus DC that have currently abolished the death penalty. Virginia was just one earlier this year. So we're looking for Ohio to be the 24th. And we're excited because we know that the system is completely broken. It is arbitrarily based on race, geography. It's expensive. it's inhumane and it's ineffective, and it puts innocent lives at risk. So I think no matter where you're coming from this argument, and it's kind of similar to bail in that way, you can kind of approach these issues, if you want to argue from a racial disparities lens, or, a fiscally concern, or just morally looking at, the cost of innocence. It's time for it to change. And we're really excited to see that it may be happening this legislative session. So there are currently 2 bills, one in the Senate, Senate Bill 103, and then in the House, House Bill 183. And so we were watching those kind of similar tracks. They are actually last week on the Senate, we had our proponent testimony hearing for Senate Bill 103. So it was, again, just to be in that room had to be fantastic, as both of these issues were talked about. And we're watching to see when the House side will have proponent testimony. And I do want to note in terms of sponsors on the Senate Bill 103 and longtime champion for the Ohio Fairness Act, as well as for abolishment of the death penalty, is Senator Nikki Antonio, who kind of kicked us off in this session today. And I'm happy to drop in the chat if you are interested in getting involved. You can link up with the ACLU's action teams. We are working on both of these issue areas. If you want to get kind of into it on the grassroots side, do some mobilization, we would love to have you. And I think that's a great way to join in this effort.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you for all of the action alerts that you send out and for everybody's attention, so that you are watching the Statehouse and making sure that nothing gets by unnoticed, and you help to activate all of us. So we really have had a rich conversation today about so many different policy aspects that impact LGBTQ lives here in Ohio. Recapping just a little bit, especially for folks who may have joined later in the session, we started at the federal level with the Equality Act, and we heard from Shawn that there is urgency around the Equality Act actually moving. It hasn't happened in years where we have seen the potential for a vote in the Senate. It really brings Ohio front and center, because Senator Portman, our Ohio senator, who also with Senator Brown, who has been a co-sponsor of the legislation for many years, but Senator Portman is one of the key voices who needs to be moved in order to move that piece forward. Then we talked a little bit about the Ohio Fairness Act, which is similar legislation, but different, and puts protections in Ohio code, which is different. The Ohio Fairness Act, looking for advancements on that front probably this fall. And then we heard from James around some terrible bills, anti-trans youth bills that are seemingly moving too quickly in the House, and that we need to stop imminently. Thank you so much for all that you contributed in sharing how harmful they are, James, and how we can activate against them. And then we turned to how Ohio's law is outdated and criminalizes folks living with HIV and AIDS, and the fact that it is in desperate need of a full overhaul. It needs to be modernized. Some states have even chosen to repeal it. We think that modernizing is the more likely possibility right now here in Ohio. And the Ohio Health Modernization Movement is how you can join in that effort. And then finally, we've ended this just now with Sabrina from the ACLU of Ohio, first of all, celebrating that ACLU changed birth certificate law in Ohio and really made us one of the last states to make this legal. Sadly, we were the holdout, but now you can change your gender marker in Ohio to match your gender identity. And the legal clinic at Equality Ohio and the collective legal clinic sessions with Equitas, Living with Change, Trans Ohio, Octopus, and others are making that possible. So we've talked about a lot. We're in the final bit of our time here. And what I really want to invite this into is questions from our audience and from our fellow panelists, if there's something that we haven't addressed yet. We know that the policy needs in Ohio are limitless. We actually invite everybody here to join tonight's fireside chat, where we want to hear from you about policy needs that you are seeing in your own lives, that Equality Ohio you want us to be addressing in the years coming up and in the time in the future. So plugging for that, look on your Whova agenda, sign up for our fireside chat tonight. But what questions do folks have that we can help to be answering?
You know, ODH made a very quiet, kind of private announcement on their own website, and it was one sentence that's on their website now. So that's why these clinics are so important, and there will be more. We're just having the first one on the 26th.
Right, I put that one in. I thought, wait a minute, Ohio, is that true?
It sure is. And the probate courts are going to catch up because we're going forward.
Yeah. And that's a great point, James. You know, we don't have a clear, here you go, here's where the rules are. This is how you get your birth certificate changed. The way the systems work in Ohio is we have 88 probate courts, and that actually means 88 different potential policies around how to do this. We certainly know what procedures we would like to see in place. We certainly know that we want them to be the least burdensome as possible, and that is what we have been advocating as organizations. But we don't have a unified system yet, which is why we really encourage folks who want to get their gender marker changed to attend one of our legal clinics, or to call the Equality Ohio intake 855 LGBT law, or the intake form online, which is always available, so that you can have a person look at your particular situation, the location in Ohio that you are, and try to walk you through the process. James, any other updates on that? I know that you posted some things in the chat, but this is such a hot new topic in such an area of legal and lived equality that is right at our fingertips.
Yeah, like you said, Alana, there's 88 counties in Ohio and 88 probate courts. So there are only a couple probate courts right now that actually have updated policies pertaining to how to actually change your birth certificate if you are transgender or non-binary. The other courts are kind of making it up as they go along, or else just they don't have any policies whatsoever yet. So if you happen to call your probate court and they tell you it's impossible to change your birth certificate policy yet, please reach out to Trans Ohio or Equality Ohio, Equitas as well, because we are working on this, and that's information that's important to us too. So as we're figuring out what these different policies are in the various areas of the state, we can find out which ones aren't as inclusive. I don't want to call out any counties because by the time y'all watch this at home, it may have changed. But there are some good policies right now in some counties that don't require any kind of documentation. And there are others that are asking for some kind of documentation as to gender change. So it may be your passport letter and it may be something else. So that's why it's really important to attend these clinics and not necessarily do self-help on your own, because I don't want folks out there submitting a lot of sensitive personal health documents that you don't need to.
Thank you so much for that, James. And it is true. I mean, judges have to follow the law no matter what, of course. But frankly, we also have a lot of judges that are really encouraged at this change, have been advocating publicly and privately for this change for a long time, and are really encouraged that the health department has just declared that it will now finally receive these changes and requests for them. So stay tuned, clearer guidance coming. And in the meantime, please call Equitas, Equality Ohio, or Trans Ohio with questions about that so that we can help you in your particular legal situation. Any questions emerging through the Whova app, either Dominic or Siobhan on the Equality Ohio side? We can't see that part. Anything to share at this point? I'm going to take that as a no if it hasn't appeared here in the chat. Well, friends, thank you so much. You know, oh, we did get one ping. Could we address some of the local advocacy that's happening? Great question. Great question. So as part of our overall theory of change for advocating for statewide non-discrimination protections, we know that the power of folks at the local level cannot be understated. And so we are proud to celebrate that 33 localities, mostly cities, but one county, have added local non-discrimination protections. Yeah, that is worth a hand shake. James, that is tremendous. That is tremendous. Just 5 or 6 years ago, that list was at about 13. So really with some focused intentionality, we have worked so hard to improve the level of legal equality at the local level, but it still leaves that very real situation that your civil rights depend on your zip code. And we know that that is untenable and that we really do need statewide non-discrimination protections. If local advocacy, if local non-discrimination work is something that you live in a city and want to make that change, strongly encourage you to reach out to Gwen Stembridge. She's our Director of Statewide Civic Engagement, and she oversees and coordinates that work among many things that she does across Ohio. Some cities are really ready for the legal change. Some cities we know probably are not ready to actually pass a law, but educational conversations can be a major step in that work. And look, Gwen has posted in the chat giving her email address. Please reach out to Gwen about this. We know that we always talk in terms of changing hearts, minds, and laws at Equality Ohio. That is where the rubber meets the road, is at the local level, because these hard conversations happen across neighborhoods and between folks who live near each other in the same community. That real work translates then to our state level, so that our state legislators can say, wow, okay, we keep having these cities pass this. Ohio really is ready for this wholesale change through the Ohio Fairness Act. And frankly, Shawn, you get the perspective of the national 250 plus cities across the nation. That speaks volumes to the Equality Act as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to put it, I think for me, a very good example of what you're talking about there, Alana. The work that you all have done, that Gwen has led in municipalities like Medina, have paid huge dividends in terms of who and how we can talk to state lawmakers and federal lawmakers. That this municipal work also builds leaders in our movement and really helps pull all of these state and federal bills forward, because now we have folks who know what they're talking about and are empowered and passionate about.
And Ohio really has led in this level at the municipal space. I think Florida might be another state that has slightly more municipalities than Ohio that have done this, but we're a close second. And we do so really in partnership. Thank you to the legal minds at HRC who also help us in this work to make sure that we are always sticking in parity with state and federal law around things like religious exemptions and other areas, so that we're never rolling back rights for LGBTQ folks or anyone else. We're going to make this the last call for questions. Any other burning questions in the policy sphere? Go for it, Zach.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight also on the local level that municipalities across the state of Ohio will be electing members to city council, mayors, judges, I mean, everything all across the state. So check to make sure that your voter registration is up to date and mark November 2nd on your calendar. There are also two special elections that are happening at the federal level, including an election to replace former Representative Steve Stivers, and also former Representative and now Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge, to the Ohio 15th, the Ohio 11th, that will be happening on August 3rd. And the voter registration deadline, I believe, to participate if you live in one of those districts is July 6th.
Fantastic reminder. Oops, someone else was going. Go for it. Gwen has put in the chat, check your voter registration here. And a reminder, those special elections are so important. They don't happen all the time, which is why they can sometimes be off of our radar, but please mark your calendars for that and check your voter registration, that it's up to date, and remember to go vote. All right. I want to thank everybody here today. Sabrina Harris, thank you for your work at the ACLU of Ohio. James, thank you so much, James Knapp, Chair of Trans Ohio. We've been working together a long time on this. It's so wonderful to partner with you. Shawn Copeland, thank you so much for your work at HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. Zach McCune, thank you so much for everything you do at Equitas Health. This has been a conversation about LGBTQ policy at the Statehouse, the federal level, and a little bit at the local level as well.